Morning, Mercy Village Church, core team members, and anyone else who's watching. Super excited to continue this series through the Psalms of Contrition, a series we're calling Make War, Contrite Hearts in a Battle for Joy. And so these are just going to be quick devotionals. I hope you know a pastor defines the word quick and devotionals a little bit differently, but I'm going to try to keep these short. Psalm chapter 6 today. I call this God to the rescue because what we see is that the mercy of God is greater than the joy-stealing power of sin, the joy-stealing power of pain, and the joy-stealing power even of death in this psalm, Psalm chapter 6. And so let's dive right in. We'll start with what's called the superscription. So a lot of your psalms will actually have something in kind of title case font or in bold font that's actually inspired. Those are found in the original manuscripts. Those kind of titles. This one says, to the choir master with stringed instruments according to the Sheminith, a psalm of David. So we get the author. This is David. The vast majority of the psalms are his, well over 70 of them. We also see that it's a song, which is interesting because this is a psalm of contrition. We'll see themes in here of sadness and pain and sorrow and repentance and contrition. And I think that that's informative, that we sing songs as the people of God, not just about times when we're happy and joyful, but we sing songs about the times when we were experiencing pain and sorrow and difficulty. And so that happens here. This is written to be sung in the house of the Lord. Verse 1 says, O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. And so we see that David owns his sin from the beginning. The circumstances and situations he finds himself in are a result of his sin. Now, that doesn't mean that negative situations and circumstances are always a result of your sin. It might be the result of someone else's sin. It might be the result of your obedience even sometimes, that it leads us into difficult circumstances and situations. So just because you're in difficulty doesn't mean you're sinning. But it can mean that. And for David, it did mean that in this situation. And so what he does is he seeks mercy from the right place. He says in verse 2, be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. And so he seeks mercy from God. And this is founded in his knowledge of God, as we'll see. Verse 3, my soul also is greatly troubled, but you, O Lord, how long? I call verses 1 through 3 a rent heart. The prophet Joel in chapter 2, verse 13 tells us to rend our hearts and not our garments, to return to the Lord our God. And there we get a real vivid picture of what it means to have a rent heart. It's a heart that's torn open, vulnerable before God. And that's what David is doing here. He's owning his sin. He's owning his difficulty. He's being vulnerable and open before the Lord. And that's a good place to be. David will write in Psalm 51, verse 17, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Which brings us to verses 4 and 5, where he is going to remember the promises of God. So in the midst of this rent heart, he remembers the promises of God. If you go to verses 4 and 5, turn, O Lord, deliver me, save me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you, and Sheol, who will give you praise? So it's a bold request for God to turn from what he's doing and to turn from his wrath and come instead with mercy. But it's rooted in promises. If you look at Psalm 86, verse 5, this is another psalm of David. He writes, for you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call upon you. He knows this about God. He knows that God has promised to be these things, loving, forgiving, good. Verse 15 of that same psalm, but you, O Lord, are a God merciful and glorious, merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And so he knows who God has promised to be, and so he remembers those promises. Hear me today, a rent heart is a wrecked heart without remembering the promises of God. If there's no remembered promises of God, a rent heart is a wrecked heart. But with the remembered promises of God, a rent heart can be a comforted heart, even in the most restless of nights. Verses 6 and 7, I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Just listen to that, right? He's there. He's broken. He's there because of his sin. We already talked about that. But all of us have been there, whether it's from our sin, from the sins of others, or just the circumstances and situations that we find ourselves in. Voice is hoarse. Eyes are red. Ribs hurt from crying. Nose running from sobbing. If you've been there, you know. If you spent a night in tears crying. And by the way, this night, this restless night comes in a place where he's actually remembering the promises of God, but the situation remains the same, at least in the near term. The rescue hasn't come yet. But even in his remembering, he's doing all the right things. He's remembering the promises of God. As we say in church talk, he's preaching the gospel to himself, and yet he still has nights of weeping so much that his symbolism is that he's going to flood his bed with tears. And so the remembered promises of God don't fix your situation, but they can sustain you through it, even in the waiting for the rescue. So as we wait for God to rescue, keep rending your heart. Be vulnerable and open before him. And keep remembering the promises. They will sustain you. And at the right time, God will rescue his children. Verses 8 through 10, "Depart from me, all you workers of evil. For the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and greatly troubled. They shall turn back and be put to shame in a moment." And so David, although the rescue still hasn't come when he says that, God has brought him to a place where he's up out of his bed. He's no longer weeping. He's no longer crying. He's responding in confidence that God will rescue him. He knows that he's banking on it. And the reason we can bank on the fact that God will rescue us in the right time, the reason we can bank on the fact that God hears, God wins, evil loses, wrong will be right, the reason we can bank on those is Galatians 4, verse 4. "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law," verse 5, "to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." God brought us into his family at the right time by sending Jesus at the right time to pay the penalty for our sin on the cross at the right time, and to be raised from the dead at the right time, so that all those who respond to the finished work of Jesus in faith can become the children of God at the right time. God's timing is perfect. And so David rises from his night of weeping confident. God will come through at the right time, and we can be confident today. In the midst of your circumstances, in the midst of your situations, no matter how difficult they might be today, remember, the mercy of God is greater than the joy-stealing power of sin, the joy-stealing power of pain, the joy-stealing power even of death. And so we can keep rending our hearts vulnerable before God. We can keep remembering the promises of God, and we can bank on, be confident that the rescue of God will come at the right time. Man, I'm praying for you today. I'm praying that these words fall soft on your heart and encourage you in the reality of a God who is